The desert wind carried more than dust through the streets of New Canaan that autumn of 1887. It carried whispers, judgment, and the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations that followed Clara Morrison wherever she went. The Arizona sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when she stepped out of her weathered cabin, her widow's dress already gathering the fine red dust that coated everything in this forsaken corner of the territory. New Canaan sprawled like a dying beast at the edge of the Sonoran Desert, its wooden buildings bleached gray by the relentless sun. The town had sprouted around a silver mine 5 years back, drawing desperate souls seeking fortune in the harsh landscape. Now, with the mine producing less each month, desperation had settled into the bones of the place like the ever-present dust. Clara pulled her shawl tighter despite the growing heat. 26 years old and 18 months a widow, she'd learned that black fabric drew stares as surely as it drew the sun's fury. Through the dusty main street, she could see Mrs. Henley peering from behind her store window curtains, lips already moving in gossip. The banker's wife never missed an opportunity to remind folks about poor Tom Morrison's death in that mine explosion. Suspicious. She'd call it voice dripping with false sympathy. The walk to the well was 2 miles through scrub brush and cacti, past the cemetery where Tom lay beneath a simple wooden cross. Clara's boots, worn thin at the soles, crunched against the cracked earth. The drought had been merciless this year, turning the already unforgiving land into a moonscape of fissures and dead vegetation. Water was more precious than silver now, and the communal well at the edge of town was the only reliable source. She'd made this journey countless times, but today felt different. The air hung heavy with more than heat. There was an electric quality to it, like the tension before a dust storm. Clara had learned to read the desert's moods. Survival here demanded such intimacy with the land. At Garrison's general store, she paused to catch her breath in the shade of the wooden awning. Through the window, she could see Mr. Garrison himself, his thick fingers counting coins at the register. He glanced up, caught her eye, and his expression hardened. "Mrs. Morrison," he called out, stepping onto the porch. His voice carried the authority of a man who held most of the town's debts in his ledger. "A word about your account." Clara's stomach tightened, but she kept her chin raised. "Good morning, Mr. Garrison. I'll have payment for you by week's end." "That's what you said last month." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Your husband's debts don't disappear just because he did. $300, Mrs. Morrison. The interest alone is eating you alive. Tom's debts were to the mining company, not were." Garrison's smile was cold as a desert night. "The company sold those debts to me before they pulled out. Legal and binding. You do well to remember that a woman alone has limited options for earning such a sum." The implication in his tone made Clara's skin crawl, but she merely nodded and continued on her way. Behind her, she heard Garrison mutter something to his son Jake, who lounged against the storefront. Their laughter followed her down the street like carrion birds. The sun climbed higher as Clara trudged toward the well, her water buckets banging against her legs with each step. Sweat soaked through her dress, making the heavy fabric cling uncomfortably. She passed the abandoned stamp mill, its skeleton a monument to failed dreams, and the cluster of miners' shacks where the Mexican families lived. Children played in the dust despite the heat, their laughter a bright note in the oppressive morning. She was a mile from the well when she saw him. The stranger rode a black horse, both man and beast dark silhouettes against the bleached landscape. He moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to long journeys. His broad shoulders relaxed despite the rifle across his saddle. As he drew closer, Clara could make out more details. The leather apron rolled and tied behind his saddle, the heavy saddlebags that suggested tools rather than goods, the way his dark eyes surveyed the land with careful attention. Their paths would cross at the narrow passage between 2 red rock formations. Clara slowed, uncertain. Lone riders weren't uncommon, but a woman alone had reason to be cautious. The stranger seemed to sense her wariness. He reined his horse to a stop well before the passage, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I mean no trouble. Just passing through to town." "Town's that way," Clara said, gesturing back the way she'd come. "Though I wouldn't call New Canaan much of a destination." A smile ghosted across his weathered features. "Any place with a forge'll do. I'm a blacksmith by trade, looking for work." "Elias Thorne," he added, dismounting with fluid grace. He kept his distance, letting his horse drink from a small canteen. "Been riding from Texas way." Clara studied him more closely. His hands were scarred from years of working hot metal, his arms corded with the muscle that came from swinging a hammer. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as steel, carrying a weight that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. "Clara Morrison," she replied after a moment. "The town's got a smithy, but old Henrik died last winter. Forge has been cold since." "Shame," Elias said, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "Good forge is like a heart, needs to keep beating, or the whole body suffers." It was an odd thing to say, poetic almost, and Clara found herself curious despite her caution. But before she could respond, the wind shifted. The electric feeling she'd noticed earlier intensified, and both of them turned to look west. The horizon had darkened, a brown wall rising from the desert floor like a tsunami of earth. A dust storm, massive and fast-moving, bearing down on them with frightening speed. "Hell," Elias muttered, "already moving. That's coming fast. Is there shelter?" Clara's mind raced. The well was still a mile off, the town even farther, but she knew this land. "There's a cavern in those rocks," she said, pointing to the formation beside them. "Deep enough to wait it out." They moved quickly, Elias leading his horse while Clara grabbed her buckets. The wind was picking up, sending small devils of dust spinning across their path. The temperature dropped suddenly as the storm's leading edge blocked the sun. The cavern was really more of a deep overhang, carved by wind and ancient water into the red sandstone. They squeezed inside just as the storm hit in earnest. The world outside disappeared behind a curtain of flying sand and debris, the howling wind drowning out all other sound. Elias hobbled his horse near the back of the shelter, speaking soft words to calm the animal. Clara pressed herself against the rock wall, clutching her buckets and trying not to think about being trapped in close quarters with a stranger. But as the storm raged and the dust tried to find its way into their shelter, she found his presence oddly comforting. "First time I've seen one this big," Elias said, having to raise his voice over the wind, "though I hear Arizona's full of surprises." "It's a hard land," Clara replied. "Takes everything you've got and asks for more." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. "Sometimes the hardest lands forge the strongest people," he said. They fell silent, watching the storm rage, and in that shared silence, as the desert tried to tear itself apart outside their small shelter, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Tom's death, the absence of loneliness. If only for a moment. The storm would pass, as all storms did. She would return to town, to the whispers and debts and daily struggle for survival. He would ride on, another drifter in a land full of them. But for now, in this cave carved by time and wind, they were simply two souls taking shelter from the chaos of the world. Outside, the desert roared its fury, and the day that had started like so many others became the first page of a different story altogether. The storm passed with the day, leaving behind a transformed landscape painted in new patterns of sand and shadow. As the sun sank toward the western mountains, the temperature plummeted, reminding them both that the desert's extremes showed no mercy. Elias had gathered dry brush from deeper in the cavern during the storm's fury, and now he set about making a fire with practiced efficiency. "We'll need to wait until full dark to travel," he said, striking flint to steel. "Sand's still settling, and the horses need rest." Clara knew he was right, though propriety nagged at her. A widow alone with a strange man as night fell, the gossips would feast on this for months. But with her empty buckets and the well still a mile off, returning to town now would mean another waterless day tomorrow. The fire caught, casting dancing shadows on the cavern walls. In the flickering light, Clara could see pictographs left by ancient peoples, hunters chasing deer, spirals representing the cosmos, handprints reaching across centuries. Elias noticed her studying them. "Always amazes me," he said, settling back against his saddle. "People making their mark, even in a place hard as this. Like they're saying, 'I was here, I survived.'" "Sometimes survival isn't enough," Clara said before she could stop herself. He looked at her across the fire, those steel-gray eyes reflecting the flames. "You sound like someone who knows that firsthand." The invitation to share hung between them like the smoke from their fire. Clara found herself speaking, the words coming easier in the darkness with a stranger than they ever had with the townspeople who knew her story. "My husband Tom died 18 months ago. Mine explosion. They said it was an accident, but—" She shrugged, a gesture that held volumes. "He'd been asking questions about the company's books, said the miners weren't getting their fair share. Then one day, boom, cave-in, they called it, though Tom knew those tunnels better than anyone." Elias poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Mining companies don't take kindly to questions. Learned that myself in Colorado. You were a miner." "For a time, before I found my calling with iron and flame." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Had a forge in Amarillo until 3 months ago. Good business, steady work. Then the railroad came through, bringing their own smiths. Local baron wanted my land for a depot, when I wouldn't sell." He didn't finish, but Clara could read the rest in the tightness around his eyes. "Fire?" she guessed. "Mysterious one. Middle of the night. Destroyed the forge, the house, everything. Sheriff found a bottle of my whiskey near where it started. Decided I'd done it myself for the insurance money. Never mind I didn't have insurance. Never mind the baron's son was seen near my place that night. So you ran. So I left," he corrected gently. "Running implies guilt. I'm just a man looking for a place to start over, somewhere the past can't reach." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The past has long arms. Trust me on that. Tom's been gone 18 months, and I'm still paying his debts, still wearing his shame like this widow's dress. No shame in asking questions." Elias said firmly, "No shame in wanting justice. Tell that to Mr. Garrison. He bought Tom's debts from the mining company. Holds them over me like a sword. $300 might as well be 3,000. They fell quiet, listening to the fire crackle and the distant yip of coyotes. Above them, the desert sky unveiled its nightly spectacle, stars beyond counting, the Milky Way, a river of light across the darkness. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd simply sat and watched the stars. "My grandmother was Comanche," Elias said suddenly. "Used to tell me stories about the stars. Said they were campfires of the ancestors, watching over us. On nights like this, I almost believe her." "What else did she tell you?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "That the desert only looks empty to those who don't know how to see. That it's full of life, full of secrets. You just have to be patient enough to learn its language." "And have you learned its language?" "Some words. Enough to know when a storm's coming. Enough to find water where others see only sand." He met her eyes. "Enough to recognize when someone else speaks it too." The compliment, understated as it was, warmed Clara more than the fire. She found herself telling him about her life before Tom, about growing up on a failing ranch in New Mexico, about learning to read the weather in cloud formations and bird flights. He shared his own stories, apprenticing to a German blacksmith in San Antonio, the satisfaction of shaping raw metal into something useful, the wandering years after the war. "You fought?" Clara asked. "Confederate side. I was 16, thought I was defending Texas. Took me years to understand what we were really fighting for." His voice carried old regrets. "Another kind of debt that never gets paid off." The moon rose, full and bright, painting the desert in silver and shadow. The storm had cleared the air, and the night was crystalline in its clarity. Elias added more wood to the fire, then stood and walked to the cavern entrance. Safe to travel now, if you're wanting to get back. Clara knew she should agree. Should gather her buckets and return to her empty house, her empty life. But something held her there. The warmth of the fire, the comfort of conversation, or perhaps just the novel feeling of not being judged. Or we could wait for dawn, she heard herself say. Safer to travel in daylight. He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see his smile. Practical thinking, though your reputation is already ruined, according to the fine people of New Canaan. What's one more scandal to add to the pile? He laughed then, a rich sound that seemed to push back the darkness. Well then, Mrs. Morrison, looks like we're camping under the stars. Good thing I've got some provisions in my saddlebags. Nothing fancy jerky, hardtack, some coffee. They shared the simple meal like old friends, the formal distance between them eroding with each passing hour. Elias told her about the different types of iron, how each had its own personality, its own way of responding to heat and hammer. Clara found herself fascinated by the poetry and his practical knowledge. You speak of it like it's alive, she observed. In a way, it is. Everything has a spirit if you know how to look. This fire, these rocks, that storm today, all alive in their own way. Just like people. They respond to how you treat them. And how should people be treated? He considered this, gazing up at the stars. With honesty, with respect, with the understanding that everyone's carrying some burden, fighting some battle. The world's hard enough without adding meanness to it. It was past midnight when Elias spoke again, his voice soft in the dying firelight. A night under desert stars with the blacksmith, and he came back to forge her forever. What's that? Clara asked, startled from her drowsy contemplation of the fire. Something my grandmother used to say, about fate, about meetings that seem chance but aren't. She believed some souls were meant to find each other, even in the vastness of the desert. He seemed embarrassed suddenly. Fanciful thinking for a practical man. Maybe practical men need a little fancy, Clara said softly. The fire burned lower, and they wrapped themselves in their separate blankets on opposite sides of the glowing embers. But the connection forged in conversation remained, invisible as the heat from the coals, but just as real. Dawn came too soon, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. They doused the fire and prepared to leave their shelter. At the well, Elias helped Clara fill her buckets, then rigged a clever carry system using rope from his saddle. I'll be staying in town a few days, he said as they prepared to part ways. See if I can get that forge running again, if you need anything. Thank you, Clara said, meaning more than just the help with the water. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into her hand. It was a horseshoe nail, twisted into a delicate spiral, still warm from his touch. Made that last night while you dozed. My grandmother said iron carries promises. Keep it, and maybe those promises will hold true. Then he mounted his black horse and rode toward town, leaving Clara standing by the well with her full buckets and her fuller heart. She tucked the iron spiral into her pocket, where it seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm. The walk back to town had never seemed shorter. The whispers started before Clara's boots had dried from the morning dew. Mrs. Henley was holding court outside the general store, her voice carrying like a crow's caw across the dusty street. Out all night, I heard Jake Garrison saw her heading back from the well at dawn with that drifter who rode in yesterday, bold as brass, not even trying to hide it. Clara kept her head high as she passed, but each word stung like a scorpion. The iron spiral in her pocket seemed to burn against her palm, a tangible reminder of those peaceful hours under the stars. How quickly beauty could be twisted into something ugly in the mouths of gossips. At her small house on the edge of town, she found a notice nailed to her door. Garrison's heavy handwriting demanded payment in full by month's end, or proceedings would commence. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to find $300 or lose the only shelter she had. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hostile stares and slammed doors. The seamstress position at Mrs. Whitmore's dress shop that she'd hoped for was suddenly no longer available. The laundry work she'd done for the boarding house was no longer needed. Even the Mexican families who had always been kind grew distant, not wanting to associate with someone who had drawn the town's poisonous attention. The desert heat grew more oppressive each day, as if the very air had turned against her. Red dust coated everything, her clothes, her few pieces of furniture, settling in her lungs until each breath was a struggle. The water she'd carried from the well had to last longer now, carefully rationed as she couldn't face another journey past the watching eyes. She saw Elias once, working at the old forge, his hammer ringing against iron in a rhythm that echoed in her chest. But Jake Garrison and his cronies lounged nearby, making crude jokes loud enough to carry. Clara hurried past without stopping, though she felt Elias's eyes follow her. That night, she held the twisted iron nail and wondered if some promises were too fragile for this harsh world. A week into her isolation, the first stone crashed through her window at midnight. She jolted awake to find glass scattered across her floor, a rock wrapped in paper lying among the shards. The message was crudely drawn but clear, a picture of a woman with a noose around her neck and the words, "Harlots get what they deserve." Clara swept up the glass with shaking hands, stuffed rags in the broken window, and sat awake until dawn with Tom's old rifle across her lap. The next night brought more stones, more threats. Someone had poisoned the small vegetable garden she'd managed to coax from the desert soil. Her old mare's water trough was fouled with something that made the poor animal sick. By the second week, exhaustion wore her down like sandpaper on soft wood. She ventured out only for necessities, each trip into town a gauntlet of sneers and suggestions. Garrison himself cornered her outside the post office, his bulk blocking her escape. 2 weeks left. Widow Morrison, though I might be persuaded to extend the deadline if you were accommodating. His puffy fingers reached for her arm. "I'd rather lose the house," Clara said, jerking away. His face darkened. "You might lose more than that. Accidents happen in the desert. Just ask your husband." The threat chilled her despite the noon heat. That night, she found her chickens dead, their necks wrung, arranged in a grotesque display on her porch. The message was clear. She was next. It was a Tuesday night when they finally came for the house. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of flames. The storage shed beside her house was ablaze, the fire already licking at the main structure's wooden walls. She grabbed Tom's rifle and the small tin box containing her few valuables, her marriage certificate, Tom's pocket watch, the twisted iron nail, and ran outside. Jake Garrison stood in her yard with 3 other men, torches in hand, whiskey courage gleaming in their eyes. "Time to clean up this town," Jake slurred. "Daddy says you're a blight. We're just doing our civic duty." Clara raised the rifle, but her hands shook. "Get off my land." They laughed. One of them, a ranch hand named Coulter, threw his torch at the house. It caught the dry wood of the porch like paper. "Gonna shoot all of us. Widow, with that one rifle?" Jake stepped closer. "Or maybe you'd rather negotiate? I could convince the boys to put out the fire if you're nice enough." The flames climbed higher, and Clara knew she had moments to decide. The mare was screaming in the small corral beside the burning shed. If she tried to save the animal, the men would be on her. If she stood her ground, she'd burn with the house. A gunshot split the night, but it wasn't from her rifle. Elias stood at the gate, a revolver in one hand, his hammer in the other. In the firelight, he looked like something out of the old stories, an avenging angel in leather and iron. "Step away from the lady," he said, his voice carrying the same measured calm she remembered from the cavern. "Now! This ain't your business, Blacksmith!" Jake snarled, but his bravado wavered. "I'm making it my business." Elias fired again, the bullet kicking up dust at Jake's feet. "Next one goes higher. Your choice." The men scattered like coyotes before a wolf. Jake shouted threats as he ran, promises of return, of consequences. But for now, they were gone. Elias was already moving, releasing the terrified mare and leading her away from the flames. "Get what you can from the house," he called to Clara. "It's going to go, together." They salvaged what little they could. Clothes, a few books, the rocking chair that had been her mother's. The volunteer fire brigade never came, though the bell rang loud enough. By dawn, Clara's home was charred timber and ash, smoke still rising in the morning light like a funeral pyre. She stood among the ruins, soot-streaked and hollow-eyed. Clutching the tin box that held all she had left, the mare nuzzled her shoulder. Seeking comfort Clara didn't have to give. "Come on," Elias said gently. "You can't stay here. I have nowhere else to go. Mrs. Chen runs a boarding house on the other side of town. She doesn't care what the gossips say. I've already paid for a week." Clara looked at him, this man who kept appearing in her moments of crisis like some guardian spirit. "Why are you helping me?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because it's right. Because someone needs to stand against the garrisons of this world. Because—" He paused, then continued more softly. "Because I know what it's like to watch everything burn and have no one give a damn." She wanted to refuse, to maintain some shred of independence. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She nodded, gathering her salvaged possessions. As they walked through town, past the staring faces and whispered judgments, Clara felt something shift inside her. The fear that had paralyzed her for weeks crystallized into something harder, sharper. They had taken her home, her reputation, her peace. They had tried to break her, but iron, as Elias had told her that night under the stars, grew stronger in the fire. The boarding house was clean and quiet, run by a Chinese widow who had faced her own share of prejudice. Mrs. Chen asked no questions, simply showed Clara to a small but tidy room and brought tea that tasted of home and kindness. That night, as Clara lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the town settle into sleep, she made a decision. Garrison thought he had won, that burning her out would send her running. He was wrong. The desert had shaped her into something tougher than he knew, and now she had an ally. A blacksmith who understood that sometimes the only way to fight fire was with fire of your own. She pulled out the twisted iron nail, holding it up to catch the moonlight through the window. A promise. Elias had called it tomorrow. She would start making good on promises of her own. The town had drawn first blood, but the war was far from over. The morning after the fire, Elias Thorne made his presence known in New Canaan with the ringing of hammer on anvil. The old forge, silent since Henrik's death, roared back to life with a hunger that seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. By noon, a line of farmers and ranchers had formed, their horses needing shoes, their tools needing mending. Clara watched from the window of Mrs. Chen's boarding house as Elias worked. His movements were economical, precise, each strike of the hammer purposeful. But there was something else in the way he held himself, a coiled readiness, like a man expecting trouble and prepared to meet it. The trouble wasn't long in coming. Garrison arrived at the forge with Jake and 2 hired guns, their presence clearing the waiting customers like smoke before wind. Clara couldn't hear the words from her window, but she could read the threat in Garrison's gestures, the defiance in Elias's squared shoulders. The confrontation ended without violence, but Garrison's message had been clear. The blacksmith had chosen the wrong side. As the merchant stalked away, Elias caught sight of Clara watching. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that somehow conveyed both reassurance and warning. That afternoon, Clara ventured out for the first time since the fire. She needed work, needed money, needed to show the town she wouldn't be driven away. The twisted iron nail rested in her pocket like a talisman. At the newspaper office, old Samuel Pritchard listened to her request for work with sympathy in his rheumy eyes. "I'd hire you in a heartbeat. Clara, you've got better letters than half this town, but Garrison holds my loans. I can't." The story was the same everywhere. The hotel, the stage depot, even the saloon. Garrison's reach extended like a spider's web, trapping her in ever-tightening circles. It was near sunset when she found herself at the forge. Elias was banking the fire, his shirt soaked with sweat from the day's labor. He looked up as she approached, and something in her expression must have told him everything. "No luck," he said. It wasn't a question. Garrison's made sure of that. Clara felt the weight of exhaustion settling on her shoulders. I should leave town, start over somewhere else. Running doesn't solve anything. Trust me on that. Elias wiped his hands on his leather apron. Besides, you've got as much right to be here as anyone, more than most. Rights don't put food on the table or keep a roof overhead. He studied her for a moment, then moved to a corner of the forge where sheets of metal lay stacked. Can you read and figure? Of course. Then I've got a proposition. This forge needs organizing. Orders tracked, accounts kept, supplies managed. I can shoe horses and mend plows, but paperwork makes my head spin. Work for me. Clara stared at him. You can't afford to make enemies of the Garrisons. Already have. His smile was grim. Might as well make it count for something. Besides, a forge needs more than fire and iron. It needs order, planning. You could bring that. People will talk. They already are. A widow working for a bachelor. Let them talk. Their words are just noise. The work. That's what's real. The things we build, the people we help, that's what lasts. Clara felt the iron nail in her pocket, its twisted shape pressing against her palm. Fear warred with hope, propriety with necessity. But in the end, it was the steady certainty in his gray eyes that decided her. When do I start? Tomorrow? Dawn? And Clara? He turned back to the dying forge. Wear something you don't mind getting singed. Sparks fly in here. That night, Clara helped Mrs. Chen with the boarding house chores, earning her keep with labor since she couldn't pay in coin. The Chinese woman worked in companionable silence, occasionally sharing wisdom in her accented English. Fire burn away old wood, she said, kneading bread for the morning. Make room for new growth. You see. Clara hoped she was right. Dawn came painted in shades of rose and gold, the desert air still cool before the day's heat. Clara arrived at the forge to find Elias already working, the fire burning hot and clean. He'd cleared a space near the front, setting up a desk made from salvaged boards and sawhorses. Your kingdom, he said with a slight bow. Such as it is. They fell into a rhythm surprisingly quickly. Clara organized the chaos of orders Henrik had left behind, created a system for tracking work and payments. Elias moved between forge and anvil, his hammer singing its metallic song. When customers came, she handled the negotiations, her educated speech and professional manner disarming those who'd expected to find a fallen woman. The work was hard but satisfying. For the first time since Tom's death, Clara felt useful, productive. The books balanced, the orders flowed, and slowly, the forge became a hub of activity. Farmers appreciated fair prices and honest work. Their wives, initially skeptical, found Clara's dignity in the face of gossip admirable. Not everyone was won over. Jake Garrison and his cronies lounged across the street, making their presence a constant threat. Suppliers suddenly found themselves short of coal and iron when Elias tried to buy. The bank refused to open an account for the forge's earnings. But for every obstacle, they found a solution. Coal from the Mexican miners who Elias treated with respect. Iron salvaged from abandoned claims. Cash kept in a strongbox, hidden beneath the forge floor. They were building something, Clara realized. More than just a business, they were building a small pocket of resistance to Garrison's stranglehold on the town. It was the end of their second week working together when Elias asked her to stay after closing. The forge was quiet, only the faint glow of banked coals providing light. He pulled something from beneath his workbench, a small iron box, ornately decorated with twisted metal vines. Made this for you, he said, unusually hesitant. For your important papers, the ones you saved from the fire. Clara took the box, running her fingers over the intricate metalwork. It was beautiful, practical art shaped by patient hands. It's lovely, but I can't. You can. His voice was firm. You've brought order to this chaos, given the forge new life. It's just iron and time. Clara, I've got plenty of both. She looked up at him. This man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. In the dim light, with the smell of coal and hot metal around them, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved like morning mist. "That night in the desert," she said softly, "you said something about promises. I remember. Is this one of them? This forge, this work together?" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar on his jaw from some old injury. Maybe, or maybe it's just the beginning of something bigger. The moment stretched between them, fragile as blown glass. Then the door burst open, shattering it entirely. Jake Garrison stood there with 3 men, all armed, all drunk on whiskey and bravado. Well, working late, are we? How cozy." Elias stepped smoothly between Clara and the intruders. "We're closed. Garrison, come back tomorrow if you need horseshoes." "Oh, I don't need shoes." Jake's grin was ugly. "I need you gone. Blacksmith, you and your whore both. Daddy's made an offer, leave town tonight, or things get unpleasant." "Things are already unpleasant," Elias said calmly. "Your father made that certain when he burned out Mrs. Morrison. That was just a warning. This is a promise." Jake pulled his revolver, not quite pointing it, but letting its presence speak. "Last chance. Get, or get buried." Clara felt fear spike through her, but also anger. These men, with their threats and their torches, thinking they owned the world. She stepped out from behind Elias, her chin raised. "We're not going anywhere," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "This forge is legal." "Our work is honest. If your father has a problem with that, he can take it to the territorial judge." Jake laughed. "Judges can be bought. Widow. Haven't you learned that yet?" "Some can," Elias agreed. "Others can't, and there's a federal marshal due through next month. Wonder what he'd make of burned houses and midnight threats." The laughter died on Jake's face. The federal marshals were known for their incorruptibility, their willingness to take on local tyrants. It was a card Elias had been holding back, and Clara could see it hit home. "You've got a month then," Jake snarled. "Make your peace with it." He backed toward the door, his men following. "This ain't over, not by a long shot." When they were gone, Clara found herself shaking. Elias steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch warm through the fabric of her sleeve. "Federal marshal?" she asked. "Maybe, maybe not, but they don't know that." He smiled tightly. "Sometimes the threat of justice is almost as good as justice itself, and when they find out, then we'll deal with what comes together, if you're willing." Clara looked around the forge at the glowing coals, the solid anvil, the desk where she'd brought order from chaos, at the man who'd given her not just work, but purpose, not just protection, but partnership. Together, she agreed, and meant it. Outside, the desert night spread its blanket of stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. But inside the forge, there was warmth and light and the promise of tomorrow's work. The battle lines were drawn now, clear as the mountains against the sky, but Clara no longer faced them alone. The violence came 3 weeks later, on a night when the desert wind howled like a living thing. Clara had stayed late at the forge, reconciling accounts by lamplight while Elias finished a rush order for the Hernandez family. The comfortable rhythm of their work was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Jake Garrison and 5 men burst through the door, their faces masked with bandanas, but their identities clear from Jake's distinctive swagger. They moved with the coordination of those who'd planned their attack. 2 men grabbing Elias while the others began smashing equipment. "Should have taken the offer," Jake said, his voice muffled but recognizable. "Now you'll learn what happens to those who defy the garrisons." Elias fought back with the strength of a man who'd spent years working iron. But 6 against 1 were odds that even he couldn't overcome. They forced him to his knees, and Jake picked up a hammer from the workbench. "Maybe we'll break your hands. Blacksmith, see how well you work then." "No." Clara emerged from behind the desk, Tom's old rifle in her hands. "Let him go." Jake laughed. "You going to shoot us all? Widow, with 1 gun. I only need to shoot 1. She aimed at Jake, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The others might scatter like the cowards they are." The tension in the forge crackled like the coals in the fire. Then one of the masked men, Coulter by his build, made a grab for the rifle. Clara pulled the trigger, the shot going wide but close enough to make him dive for cover. In the confusion, Elias broke free, his fist connecting with the nearest attacker's jaw. The fight was brutal and brief. Elias wielded a piece of bar stock like a club. Clara used the rifle butt when men got too close, but they were outnumbered. And when Jake pulled his revolver, the game changed. "Enough," he shouted, pointing the gun at Clara. "Drop the rifle, or I drop her." Elias froze, then slowly lowered his makeshift weapon. Clara let the rifle fall from her hands. Jake's eyes glinted with triumph above his mask. "On your knees, both of you." They had no choice but to comply. Jake walked around them slowly, savoring his power. "You know what your problem is? You think you're better than us? The high and mighty widow and her pet Blacksmith. Time someone taught you your place." He raised his revolver, and Clara closed her eyes, thinking of Tom, of the stars that night in the desert, of promises made in twisted iron. Then the forge door exploded inward again. Sheriff Wilson stood there with 2 deputies, all armed, all looking decidedly unfriendly toward Jake and his gang. "Drop the weapons, now." "Sheriff," Jake said, trying to sound casual. "Just having a discussion with these folks about—" "Save it. Garrison, half the town heard the shot, and hiding your face doesn't hide that fancy gun belt your daddy gave you." Wilson's weathered face was grim. "All of you, weapons down. You're under arrest." Jake's gang complied reluctantly, knowing they were caught. As the deputies collected guns and removed masks, confirming what everyone already knew, Jake tried one last gambit. "My father will have your badge for this." "Wilson." "Maybe," the sheriff agreed. "But I've been wearing this star since before you were born. Boy. And I've had about enough of the Garrisons thinking they own this town." He looked at Clara and Elias. "You two hurt." "We'll survive," Elias said, helping Clara to her feet. His eye was already swelling, and Clara could feel bruises forming on her arms. But they were alive. "We'll need statements," Wilson said, "and you might want to find somewhere safe for tonight. Garrison Sr. won't take this well." As the deputies marched Jake and his accomplices out, the sheriff lingered. "Should have done this months ago," he said quietly. "After your husband died, Mrs. Morrison. But Garrison had me convinced it was just an accident, and I took the easy path." He touched his hat brim. "I'm sorry for that." After he left, Clara and Elias stood in the wreckage of the forge. Tools lay scattered. The desk was overturned, and one of the windows was shattered. But the forge itself, the heart of the operation, remained intact. "Well," Elias said, gingerly touching his swollen eye, "that could have gone worse." Clara laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to it. "Worse, we nearly died. But we didn't. And now Jake's in jail, the sheriff's finally doing his job, and—" He paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "And you saved my life. That was some shooting." "I missed—" "You missed on purpose. Takes more courage to wound the air next to a man than to kill him." He picked up the fallen rifle, checking it for damage. "Where'd you learn to handle a gun like that?" "My father. He said a woman alone in this territory needed to know how to protect herself." She looked around the damaged forge. He was right. They spent the next hour cleaning up the worst of the mess, working in companionable silence. It was past midnight when Elias finally banked the forge fire and turned to her. "Sheriff's right. You shouldn't go back to the boarding house tonight. Garrison will post bail for Jake by morning, and they'll be looking for revenge. Where else can I go? I won't be driven into hiding." "Not hiding, strategic retreat." He hesitated, then continued. "I've been sleeping in the back room here. It's not much, but there's a cot, and I can keep watch. You could take my room for tonight." It was improper, scandalous even, but after everything that had happened, Clara found she cared less about propriety than survival. All right. But we take shifts watching. You need rest too. The back room was indeed sparse. A narrow cot, a washstand, a trunk for belongings. But it was clean and warm from its proximity to the forge. Elias gave her his blanket and took first watch, sitting in a chair by the door with the rifle across his knees. Clara lay on the cot, exhaustion pulling at her, but sleep refusing to come. Through the thin wall, she could hear Elias moving occasionally, the creak of his chair, the soft sound of him stoking the fire, protecting her, as he had since that first day in the desert. "Elias," she called softly. "Yes? What happens tomorrow? When Jake gets out?" There was a long pause. "We keep going. We open the forge. We do our work. We show them they can't break us. And we watch each other's backs. Is it worth it? All this trouble for a forge? For staying in a town that doesn't want us?" She heard him stand, his footsteps approaching the doorway. He didn't enter, maintaining propriety even now, but his voice was closer. "It's not about the forge, Clara. It's about the right to live free, to work honest, to not be driven out by men who think money makes them kings. If we run now, they win, and men like that will keep winning until someone stands up to them. Even if it costs us everything?" "What's everything? I've already lost one life to fire and lies. You've lost your husband, your home, but we're still here, still fighting. That's not nothing." Clara turned his words over in her mind like stones in a stream, feeling their weight and shape. "Tom would have liked you," she said finally. "He believed in standing up to bullies too. It's what got him killed. Maybe what got him killed was standing alone. We're not alone now." The simple truth of it warmed her more than the blanket. "No," she agreed. "We're not." She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to find the positions reversed. She in the chair with the rifle, Elias on the cot. He'd draped his coat over her shoulders while she slept. Outside, the first hints of dawn were painting the sky purple and gold. Clara watched the sunrise through the forge's east window, thinking about cycles of light and darkness, fire and ash. The desert taught hard lessons about survival, about the things that endured and the things that burned away. She thought she was beginning to understand which was which. When Elias woke, they shared coffee and cold biscuits in companionable silence. Then, as the town began to stir, they opened the forge for business as usual. If their hands shook a little as they worked, if they startled at sudden sounds, well, that was between them and the desert wind. Word of the night's event spread quickly. By noon, a steady stream of townspeople had found reasons to visit the forge. Some came to gawk, but others, more than Clara had expected, came to offer support. Miguel Hernandez shook Elias's hand firmly. "Mrs." Chen brought food and fierce disapproval of bad men making trouble. Even some of the more respectable matrons nodded to Clara with something approaching approval. The tide was turning, slow but sure as the desert seasons. But as the sun reached its zenith, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not Jake or his father, but a stranger in a black coat despite the heat, riding a pale horse. He stopped at the forge, dismounted with deliberate movements, and studied the building with eyes cold as winter stars. "I'm looking for Elias Thorne," he said, his voice carrying an accent Clara couldn't place. "I believe he and I have unfinished business from Texas." Clara felt the bottom drop out of her newfound hope. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with them, and it wore the face of a man who looked like he'd been forged in some darker fire than any blacksmith's forge could hold. The stranger's arrival had frozen the forge in a moment of suspended time. Clara watched Elias's face go carefully blank, the hammer in his hand lowering slowly to his side. Whatever history existed between these men, it carried the weight of old wounds. "Josiah Crane," Elias said finally. "Didn't expect to see you this far from Amarillo." Crane smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "You left quite a mess behind, Thorne. My employer doesn't appreciate loose ends." Clara's mind raced. This had to be connected to the fire that had driven Elias from Texas, the false accusations that had stolen his life there. She moved closer to the desk where Tom's rifle rested, recently cleaned and loaded. Your employer burned down my life, Elias said, his voice steady as iron. I'd say we're even. Baron Hartley doesn't see it that way. You refused to sell, caused him considerable embarrassment. Then you had the audacity to survive the fire. Crane's pale eyes shifted to Clara. And now you're making the same mistakes here, getting involved with locals, putting down roots. Haven't you learned? What I've learned, Elias said, setting down his hammer with deliberate care, is that running doesn't solve anything. So whatever you've come to do, let's have it done. But before Crane could respond, the morning's drama took another turn. Sheriff Wilson appeared with Judge Samuel Pritchard, both men looking grim. Behind them, Clara could see Garrison Sr.'s carriage pulling up to the jail. Mrs. Morrison, the sheriff called out. Judge needs to speak with you, both of you. Crane stepped back, touching his hat brim mockingly. I'll wait. Business can always wait for the law. Inside the sheriff's office, Judge Pritchard, a man Clara had known since childhood, looked uncomfortable behind the desk. Clara, I'm sorry about this, but Garrison's filed charges. Says you and Mr. Thorne assaulted his son and several upstanding citizens last night. They attacked us, Clara protested. They broke into the forge, threatened us with guns. I know, the judge said wearily. But it's your word against theirs, and Garrison's also produced this. He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a deed. Says he bought your husband's land rights last year, including the plot the forge sits on. Clara snatched up the document, scanning it quickly. Her heart sank. It was Tom's signature, but the date. This is dated a week before Tom died. He never mentioned selling. Because he didn't, Elias said quietly. Look at the ink. Clara, it's too fresh for a year-old document, and the witnesses, he pointed to 2 names. Unless I'm mistaken, one of these men died 2 years ago. Judge Pritchard leaned forward, studying the document more carefully. Sheriff Wilson moved closer too, squinting at the signatures. By God, Wilson muttered. Frank Morse has been in the ground since '85. I helped bury him. The judge's face hardened. This is a serious accusation. If this deed is forged. If... Clara felt anger burning through her fear. Judge, you know Garrison's been trying to force me out since Tom died. First the debts, then the fire. Now this? How much more evidence do you need? The law requires proof. Clara, not just suspicion. But the judge was looking troubled now. Sheriff, I want you to secure all documents related to land transfers in the past 2 years, and send for Marshal Campbell in Tucson. This may be beyond our local jurisdiction. Already sent for him, Wilson admitted. After last night's fracas, should be here within the week. They emerged from the sheriff's office to find a crowd gathering. Word of the forged deed had somehow already spread. Small towns had no secrets, and people were choosing sides. Garrison stood by his carriage, Jake beside him, both wearing expressions of barely contained fury. This isn't over, Garrison shouted. You think you can slander my good name? I'll see you both hanged for this. But the crowd's mood had shifted. Miguel Hernandez stepped forward. We all know Frank Morse was dead before that paper was signed. Senor Garrison, you think we're fools? Other voices joined in, months of resentment finally finding courage in numbers. Garrison's face darkened as he realized his grip on the town was slipping. That's when Josiah Crane made his move. Interesting times in your little town, he said, loud enough for all to hear. Mr. Garrison, I believe you and I should talk about mutual interests, about removing obstacles. Clara felt a chill despite the desert heat. An alliance between Garrison and whoever Crane represented could only mean more trouble. But before anyone could respond, the morning calm was shattered by a deep rumble from the west. Storm coming, someone muttered, but Clara knew better. That wasn't thunder. A massive dust storm, larger than the one that had brought her and Elias together, was bearing down on New Canaan. The sky darkened to an ominous brown, and the wind picked up, sending hats flying and horses dancing nervously. Everyone inside, Sheriff Wilson bellowed. This is going to be a bad one. The crowd scattered, seeking shelter. Clara and Elias ran for the forge, but Crane followed, slipping inside just as they barred the door against the rising wind. "Cozy," Crane said, brushing dust from his black coat. "Just the three of us." Elias positioned himself between Crane and Clara. "State your business and go. My business is you, Thorne. Baron Hartley wants you back in Texas, dead or alive, though he has a preference." Crane's hand rested casually on his pistol. "But I'm a reasonable man. There might be another way." Outside, the storm hit with full force. The building shook, dust seeping through every crack. In the weird half-light, Crane's pale face looked almost ghostly. "What other way?" Clara asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "Information," Crane said. "About what really happened the night of the fire. Who was really responsible? Testimony that could clear your friend here for the right price." "You know who was responsible." Elias growled. "Hartley's son, on his father's orders. I know many things, but knowing and proving are different beasts." Crane smiled that cold smile again. "Here's my offer. You come back to Texas with me. Face trial with my testimony in your favor. You'll be acquitted, free to go wherever you please. In exchange, you leave this town tonight and never return." "And if he refuses?" Clara demanded. "Then I'll collect the bounty Hartley's placed on his head, and you, Mrs. Morrison, will be left to face the garrisons alone. Your choice." The storm raged outside, but inside the forge, a different kind of tempest was building. Clara could see Elias weighing the options, could see him considering sacrificing himself for her safety. She couldn't let that happen. Moving to the desk where she'd been working earlier, she pulled out a leather portfolio. "Before you make any deals, Mr. Crane, you should see this." Inside were documents she'd been collecting for weeks, correspondence between garrison and various officials, records of forged documents, evidence of the conspiracy around Tom's death. But at the bottom was something new, something she'd found just that morning in Tom's old papers. "A letter," she said, handing it to Crane. "From Baron Hartley to Garrison, dated 6 months ago, discussing their mutual interests in territorial expansion and mentioning a blacksmith who was proving troublesome." Crane's eyes narrowed as he read. "Where did you get this?" Tom was investigating more than just the mine's books. He was tracking connections between corrupt businessmen across the territory. Clara lifted her chin. "Kill Elias, and I make sure every newspaper from here to San Francisco gets copies. Your Baron's empire won't survive that kind of scrutiny." For the first time, Crane looked uncertain. Outside, the storm began to abate, its fury spent. In the relative quiet, they could hear voices, people emerging from shelter. "Clever," Crane admitted finally. "But this letter also implicates your late husband. Are you prepared for that to become public?" "Tom died seeking justice," Clara said firmly. "He'd want his work finished, no matter the cost to his reputation." Elias moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "So, what's it going to be? Crane, you taking me in, or are you smart enough to know when the game's changed?" Crane holstered his pistol with deliberate slowness. "Baron Hartley won't be pleased. But then, he's not the only power in Texas. There are others who might find this information valuable." He moved toward the door, then paused. "A word of advice. Thorne, next time someone burns you out, make sure they finish the job, and Mrs. Morrison, your husband was a dangerous man. Try not to follow too closely in his footsteps." Then he was gone, disappearing into the dust-hazed afternoon like a ghost returning to shadow. Clara's knees suddenly felt weak, and Elias caught her arm, steadying her. "That was brilliant," he said. "Also possibly insane. You just blackmailed a hired killer." "I protected what matters," she corrected, looking up at him. "Tom always said information was the most powerful weapon in the territories. Turns out he was right." Through the window, they could see the town emerging from the storm. Garrison's carriage was leaving, Crane's pale horse beside it, but more importantly, they could see their neighbors beginning the familiar ritual of cleanup, of rebuilding after the desert's fury. "We're not done," Clara said. "Garrison won't give up, and Crane might change his mind." "No," Elias agreed. "But we've bought time, and sometimes that's all you need to turn the tide." He was right. In the days that followed, Clara would uncover more evidence, build stronger cases, rally more support. The federal marshal would arrive to find a town ready to testify, ready to fight for justice. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, she allowed herself a moment of victory. The forge still stood. They still stood. And in a land that tested everyone who dared call it home, that was no small thing. Federal Marshal James Campbell arrived in New Canaan on a Thursday morning. His presence announced by nothing more than the dust his horse kicked up on Main Street. He was a lean man in his 40s, with eyes that had seen too much and a star that had weathered countless storms. Clara watched from the forge as he tied his mount outside the sheriff's office, his movements economical and purposeful. "That's him," Elias said quietly beside her. "Our last hope for real justice." The trial convened 3 days later in the town's makeshift courthouse, really just the old meeting hall with benches arranged theater style. Judge Pritchard presided, but Marshal Campbell's presence lent the proceedings a gravity they'd never possessed before. The federal government was watching now. Clara sat in the witness section, the leather portfolio of evidence heavy in her lap. She'd spent sleepless nights organizing every document, every testimony, every piece of proof that could expose Garrison's corruption and clear Elias's name. Across the aisle, Garrison sat with Jake and their lawyer from Tucson, all three wearing expressions of barely contained fury. The prosecutor, brought in from the territorial capital, opened with the forged deed. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not merely fraud, but a pattern of intimidation, violence, and murder that has held this town in thrall for too long." One by one, witnesses took the stand. Miguel Hernandez testified about Garrison's price fixing at the general store. Mrs. Chen spoke softly but firmly about the threatening visits she'd received when she'd first opened her boarding house. Sheriff Wilson, looking older than his years, admitted his failures to investigate Tom Morrison's death properly. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the witness stand with steady steps, aware of every eye in the room upon her. The prosecutor approached with kind eyes but serious demeanor. "Mrs. Morrison, please tell the court about the night your house was burned." Clara spoke clearly, detailing the harassment, the threats, the flames that had consumed everything she owned. She produced the threatening notes that had preceded the fire, salvaged from her tin box. She described Jake Garrison standing in her yard with a torch, his words slurred with drink and malice. "He said they were cleaning up the town," she testified, "that I was a blight that needed removing." Garrison's lawyer tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Morrison, that you've been seen keeping company with Mr. Thorne, a drifter with his own criminal past?" "Mr. Thorne is a skilled blacksmith who has brought honest work back to this town," Clara replied firmly. "As for his past, I believe that's what we're here to examine. The lies told about good men by those who profit from their destruction." The lawyer pressed harder. "You were out all night with this man, unchaperoned, were you not? Perhaps your reputation—" "Objection!" The prosecutor was on his feet. "Mrs. Morrison's reputation is not on trial here." Sustained. Judge Pritchard ruled, but the damage was done. Clara could hear the whispers rippling through the gallery. The trial continued for 2 more days. Elias testified about the fire in Amarillo, about Baron Hartley's attempts to steal his land. The connection between Hartley and Garrison became clearer with each document presented. Then came the surprise witness, Josiah Crane himself. The hired gun entered the courthouse like a shadow given form, his black coat dusty from the trail. He took the oath with an ironic smile and proceeded to systematically destroy Garrison's defense. "Yes, I was hired by Baron Hartley," he testified in his peculiar accent. "Yes, I was sent to deal with Elias Thorne, and yes, I was approached by Mr. Garrison here to form an alliance against said Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Morrison. "Why are you testifying against your employers?" the prosecutor asked. Crane's pale eyes found Clara in the gallery. "Let's say I've recently become convinced that there are more profitable arrangements than those based purely on violence. Information, for instance, can be quite valuable to the right parties." His testimony was damning. Names, dates, amounts paid for various crimes. Crane laid it all out with the dispassion of a man discussing the weather. By the time he stepped down, Garrison's face had gone from red to ashen. The defense's case crumbled quickly. Their witnesses contradicted each other. Their documents were proven false. Their accusations fell apart under scrutiny. When the jury retired to deliberate, there was little doubt of the outcome. But Garrison wasn't finished. As the courtroom began to empty for the recess, he stood abruptly, his hand moving toward his coat. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me. Morrison!" Time seemed to slow. Clara saw the glint of metal, heard people screaming, saw Marshal Campbell reaching for his own weapon. But it was Elias who moved first, stepping between her and Garrison just as the gun fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Elias grunted, spinning from the impact, blood spreading across his shirt. Garrison tried to fire again, but Campbell's return shot caught him in the shoulder, sending him crashing into the benches. "Elias!" Clara caught him as he fell, pressing her hands against the wound in his side. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and terrifying. "Someone get the doctor! Doctor!" Matthias pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already open. "Keep pressure on it," he ordered Clara, his hands working quickly. "You, get me clean water. You, clear these gawkers back." Elias' eyes found Clara's, pain and something else flickering in their gray depths. "Worth it," he managed. "You're worth it. Don't you dare," Clara said fiercely. "Don't you dare die on me, Elias Thorne. Not now. Not after everything." The next hours blurred together. The doctor's surgery, the smell of ether and carbolic, the endless wait while Matthias worked to save Elias's life. Clara paced the outer room like a caged animal, still wearing her blood-stained dress, refusing misses. Chen's gentle suggestions that she go change. Marshal Campbell found her there as the sun was setting. "He'll live," he said without preamble. "Doc says the bullet missed anything vital. Your blacksmith's tough as the iron he works." Clara sagged with relief. Tears she'd been holding back finally falling. And Garrison, under arrest for attempted murder. His son, too, for conspiracy. With Crane's testimony and the evidence you gathered, they're looking at federal prison. Campbell studied her with those knowing eyes. "You did good work, Mrs. Morrison. Your husband would be proud." "He would," Clara agreed, wiping her cheeks. "But I think I'm ready to stop living for the dead and start living for the living." The marshal nodded, understanding. "Thorne's a good man. Bit rough around the edges, but this territory's full of those. He'll need looking after while he heals." "I'm good at looking after things," Clara said with a small smile. "It's what I do." The trial concluded 2 days later with guilty verdicts all around. Garrison and Jake were sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Their accomplices received lesser sentences, but still substantial. The general store was seized for back taxes and fraudulent dealings. Its management turned over to a committee of townspeople. Clara was there when they led the Garrisons away in shackles. The former tyrant of New Canaan looked smaller somehow, older, as if his power had been the only thing keeping him upright. He met her eyes once, and she saw not hatred but bewilderment. He truly couldn't understand how a widow and a blacksmith had brought down his empire. Elias was recovering slowly but steadily. Clara had moved him to a room in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, where she could tend him properly. The forge stood idle for now, but already she was planning its reopening, organizing the work that had piled up. On a cool evening a week after the trial, Clara helped Elias out to the boarding house's small porch. He was still pale, moving carefully, but his strength was returning. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "Marshal Campbell says Crane disappeared right after the trial," Elias said eventually. Probably halfway to California by now. Good riddance, Clara replied. Though I suspect we haven't seen the last of him. Men like that have a way of turning up when you least expect them. Let tomorrow worry about tomorrow, Elias said, reaching for her hand. We've got enough to handle today. Clara intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the calluses from years of honest work, the strength that had literally taken a bullet for her. What happens now? The town's free of garrison. Your name's been cleared. Now we rebuild. He said simply, the forge, the town, our lives, together, if you'll have me. Clara looked out at the desert, at the town that had tried to break her, at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. She thought of Tom, of the quest for justice that had cost him his life, but ultimately succeeded. She thought of those first moments with Elias in a cave, sheltering from a storm that had brought them together. Together, she agreed, squeezing his hand. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the desert wind carried the sound of hammers and saws, New Canaan already beginning to rebuild itself into something better. The forge would reopen soon, its fire burning clean and true, and two souls who had found each other in the wilderness would face whatever came next side by side. Justice had been served, as much as it ever was in the territories. But more than that, hope had been kindled, hope that even in the harshest lands, good people could stand together against tyranny and prevail. The stars emerged fully now, brilliant in the clear desert air, bearing witness to promises made and kept. 6 months had passed since the trial, and New Canaan barely resembled the town it had once been. The forge rang with life from dawn to dusk, its rhythm now joined by the hammering of new construction throughout the settlement. Where Garrison's general store had stood, a cooperative market had opened, run by a council of townspeople with Clara serving as the bookkeeper. The old hierarchies were crumbling, replaced by something that looked remarkably like community. Clara stood in the doorway of the expanded forge, watching Elias work alongside 2 apprentices, young men from the Mexican quarter whose natural skill with metal had been overlooked until now. The morning sun caught the sweat on his brow, the concentration in his movements as he demonstrated the proper technique for drawing out iron. The scar from Garrison's bullet was hidden beneath his shirt, but she knew its shape by heart, had traced it with gentle fingers during quiet moments. "Mrs. Morrison," a voice called, and she turned to find Maria Hernandez approaching with a basket. "I brought lunch for the workers. My Miguel. He says the new plowshares are the finest he's ever used. That's Elias's craftsmanship," Clara replied, accepting the basket gratefully. "Though he'll credit his apprentices, he's training them well." Maria smiled knowingly. "And when will we celebrate your wedding? The whole town is waiting." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. It was an open secret that she and Elias had grown closer during his recovery, that she spent her evenings at the forge long after the books were balanced. But they'd moved slowly, carefully, aware that rushing would only fuel the remaining gossips. "When the time is right," Clara said diplomatically, though her hand went unconsciously to the new piece of twisted iron jewelry at her throat, a necklace Elias had made for her birthday. Delicate as lace despite being forged from steel. The truth was, they were building something stronger than quick passion. Every shared meal, every evening spent talking by the forge fire, every challenge faced together was another layer of foundation. They were forging a partnership as deliberately as Elias shaped his iron, with patience and skill and an eye toward permanence. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. A family in a worn wagon pulled up to the forge, settlers heading west, their equipment in need of repair. Clara watched Elias greet them, saw how he immediately set them at ease despite their obvious poverty. "Can't pay much," the father admitted, gesturing to his broken axle. "But I can work. I'm good with my hands. Tell you what," Elias said after examining the damage. "Help my apprentices with some heavy lifting, and we'll call it square. Clara, think Mrs. Chen could put them up for the night?" This had become their way, the forge, as more than a business, but a way station for those traveling through, a place where fair dealing replaced exploitation. Word had spread along the trails, and New Canaan was becoming known as a town where travelers could find honest help. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Clara finished the day's accounting. The ledgers showed more than profit. They showed a web of connections, of debts paid in work or goods, of a community knitting itself together through mutual aid. "Good day," Elias asked, coming to stand beside her desk. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt damp with honest sweat, and Clara thought he'd never looked more handsome. "The best," she replied, closing the ledger. "The Johnsons paid off their account. The widow Martinez ordered new hinges for her doors, and those settlers you helped sent 3 of their neighbors our way." "Our way," he repeated with a smile. "I like the sound of that." The forge had cooled enough for comfort, the last light of day streaming through the windows they'd added during the expansion. In the quiet, with the apprentices gone home and the town settling into evening, they were alone with the comfortable intimacy they'd built. "Clara," Elias began, then seemed to gather himself. "I've been thinking about something my grandmother used to say, about iron and promises, about things that are meant to last." He moved to his workbench, pulling out something wrapped in soft leather. "I made this weeks ago, but I've been waiting for the right moment. Maybe there's no such thing as perfect timing in this life. Maybe there's just now." He unwrapped the object, revealing a ring unlike anything Clara had seen. It was iron, but worked so finely it looked like captured starlight, twisted and woven into a pattern that seemed to shift in the dying light. Set in the center was a small piece of silver, salvaged, she realized with a start, from the ruins of her burned home. "I went back," he explained softly. "Found this in the ashes. Figured something beautiful should come from all that destruction." He met her eyes, and she saw in them all the words he'd never been eloquent enough to say. "Clara Morrison, you've already rebuilt my life just by being in it. Would you consider making it permanent?" Clara looked at the ring, at the man who'd crafted it, at the forge they'd built together from suspicion and ash into something vital and alive. She thought of that night under the stars, of his grandmother's saying that had seemed like a jest but now felt like prophecy. "A night under desert stars with the blacksmith," she said softly, "and he came back to forge her forever." "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering with words, she kissed him, there in their forge with the last light of day blessing the moment, when they finally parted. He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it caught the light like a promise made manifest. They were married 2 weeks later, the ceremony held in the desert under a canopy of stars. The whole town turned out, Mexican families and Anglo settlers, merchants and miners, all united in celebration of something good rising from the ashes of the old order. Mrs. Chen stood as Clara's witness, Miguel Hernandez as Elias's, and Judge Pritchard performed the ceremony with obvious satisfaction. "You two have already been tested by fire," he said during the ceremony. "You've stood against injustice, faced down violence, and built something lasting from the ruins. If that's not a foundation for marriage, I don't know what is." The celebration lasted until dawn, with music from Mexican guitars, dancing that kicked up dust under the stars, and enough food to feed an army courtesy of the townswomen who'd adopted Clara as one of their own. Even Sheriff Wilson, looking years younger since Garrison's fall, was seen attempting a waltz with the stern Mrs. Whitmore. As the sun rose, Clara and Elias stood on the hill overlooking New Canaan, watching the light creep across the desert. The town below was stirring to life, their town now, truly theirs and everyone else's who'd fought for it. "No regrets?" Elias asked, his arm around her waist. "None," Clara replied firmly. "Tom would be glad, I think, to see justice done, to see the town free, to see me happy. And are you? Happy?" She turned in his arms, looking up at this man who'd ridden into her life in a dust storm and stayed to help her weather every storm since, happier than I ever thought possible. They walked back to the forge, hand in hand. ready to face whatever the desert might throw at them next. The fire was banked but ready to spring to life. Tools laid out for the day's work. The ledgers waiting for Clara's careful entries. It was ordinary. It was theirs. And it was perfect. In the years that followed, the forge became the heart of New Canaan's transformation. Where once the town had been ruled by fear and greed, it grew into a place of opportunity and justice. Clara and Elias raised 3 children in the rooms they built above the workshop, teaching them that strength came not from domination but from community, that true wealth was measured in trust and respect, and sometimes, on clear nights when the stars shone with particular brilliance, Clara would stand outside the forge and remember that first night in the cave, when 2 strangers had sheltered from a storm and found something worth fighting for. The desert hadn't grown any gentler, but they'd grown stronger, forged in fire, tempered by trials, and ultimately unbreakable. The twisted iron ring on her finger had worn smooth with years, but it still caught the light like captured starlight. A promise made and kept. A love forged to last forever in the harsh beauty of the desert they called home. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for. Someone to stand beside us when the storms come. Someone to help us rebuild when the world burns down. Someone to share the quiet moments when the stars bear witness to the love we've found against all odds. Clara had found that in Elias, and together they'd built something that would outlast them both. A legacy of justice, hope, and the unshakable belief that even in the hardest ground, love could take root and flourish. The forge fire burned on, steady and true, its light a beacon in the desert darkness. And somewhere in the vast night, coyotes sang their ancient songs while the stars looked down on all they'd made, complete and whole and perfect at last. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dust and dreams of the Old West. We hope Clara and Elias's story touched your heart as much as it touched ours. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Whether you're driving through your own desert roads or cozy at home, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of love, courage, and redemption from America's frontier days. Share your thoughts about Clara and Elias's journey. What moment resonated most with you? Until the next time, keep riding toward your own horizons.